It was a cold evening, and Maya Johnson, a 28-year-old pregnant woman, walked slowly down the quiet street towards her apartment. Her tired feet echoed on the pavement with each step she took, and she held her growing belly with one hand as she carried a bag of groceries in the other. She had just finished a long shift at the local bakery, and all she wanted was to get home, rest, and relax before her baby arrived. Maya lived in a small town, and while it wasn't the biggest place, it was still peaceful. People knew each other, and there were rarely any problems. That's why when she noticed the flashing lights of a police car in the distance, she didn't think much of it. Police officers were part of the town's daily life, and she'd seen them around before. As the car pulled up beside her, Maya didn't think it was anything out of the ordinary. But when the car stopped and the officer inside rolled down his window, she felt a shiver of discomfort run through her body. She had no reason to feel nervous. She hadn't done anything wrong. But something in the officer's eyes made her uneasy. "Hey, you," the officer called out, his voice harsh and commanding. Maya paused, standing still as she turned to face him. "Yes, officer?" she asked politely, trying to keep her voice calm. The officer, a man named Sean Stevens, didn't smile. He gave her a sharp, suspicious look, eyeing her from head to toe. He looked at the grocery bags in her hands, and then back at her belly. "What's your business out here so late?" he asked, his tone filled with distrust. Maya's heart began to beat faster. She could feel his eyes on her like they were judging her for something. But she had done nothing wrong. "I'm just heading home," she said softly. "I work at the bakery just down the street." But instead of nodding or moving along, Officer Stevens stepped out of the car, his boots hitting the pavement with a heavy thud. He didn't look like he was in any hurry to leave. Maya tried not to show her worry, but her hands tightened around her bags, and she could feel the cold night air against her skin. The officer took another step toward her. "I don't think you're supposed to be out here at this hour," he said, sounding more aggressive now. He looked down at her belly again, and there was something in his eyes, something angry, something harsh. He didn't seem to care that she was pregnant. Before Maya could respond, Stevens took another step forward. With one swift, unexpected motion, he pushed her back, kicking her in the stomach. Maya gasped in pain as she stumbled backward, clutching her belly and almost falling. The world seemed to spin around her as she struggled to stay on her feet. She had never been treated this way before, especially not by someone in uniform. "Get moving," Officer Stevens barked as if nothing had happened. He got back in his car, slamming the door shut without a second thought. Maya stood there, frozen. Her breath came in sharp gasps, and her heart raced in panic. Her body shook with fear and shock. She slowly looked around, but no one else was nearby to help. The street was empty, and the only sound she could hear was the sound of the officer's tires screeching away. Maya tried to collect herself. Her head spun as she pressed a hand to her stomach, praying that her baby was okay. How could something like this happen? How could someone in a position of power treat her this way? All she wanted was to get home, but now she felt as though the whole world had just turned against her. Maya stood in shock, unable to move for a few moments. Her mind raced, trying to understand what had just happened. The kick had been so unexpected and so cruel. It was hard to believe that a police officer could treat someone that way, especially a pregnant woman. Maya's heart pounded in her chest, and her hands shook as she reached down, gently placing them on her stomach to make sure her baby was okay. With trembling legs, she finally managed to take a few steps. Each movement felt slower and harder than usual. The pain in her stomach was sharp, and she couldn't shake the fear that something might be wrong. Tears filled her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly, not wanting to show any weakness. She needed to get help. She couldn't just stand here. Maya's feet shuffled along the sidewalk, feeling heavier with every step. She glanced around, hoping someone would notice her, but the street was empty. It was late, and most of the shops had closed. There was no one around to witness what had just happened. She felt alone, scared, and helpless. But one thought kept running through her mind. She needed to get to a hospital. As she walked, the pain didn't go away. In fact, it seemed to get worse. Her steps grew slower, and her breathing became shallow. It felt like the world around her was spinning, and she had to fight to keep her balance. But the thought of her baby kept her moving forward. She couldn't let anything happen to her child. She had to keep going. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Maya saw the lights of a hospital in the distance. Relief washed over her as she picked up the pace, desperate to get to safety. Her legs felt weak, but she pushed herself harder, focusing only on reaching the hospital doors. She stumbled as she approached, nearly losing her balance, but she managed to steady herself and made it inside. The hospital staff quickly noticed her. One nurse rushed over to her as Maya collapsed into a chair, her hands still clutching her stomach. She was gasping for air, her face pale from the shock of the attack. "Are you okay?" the nurse asked, her voice full of concern. I was attacked," Maya managed to say through shallow breaths. "A police officer. He kicked me." The nurse's eyes widened in surprise. "We need to check on you and your baby right away. Please, follow me." Maya was led to an examination room, where a team of doctors and nurses immediately began to assess her condition. They checked her heart rate, her blood pressure, and carefully examined her stomach. The pain still lingered, and Maya was terrified. But she held on to the hope that everything would be fine. After a tense few moments, one of the doctors spoke gently. "It looks like there's no serious physical damage to you or your baby. We'll keep you under observation, just to be safe." Relief flooded through Maya's body, but it didn't take away the fear and anger she felt. She couldn't understand why someone would do something so cruel, especially to a pregnant woman. And why did it have to be a police officer? The very person who was supposed to protect people had hurt her without any reason at all. As the doctors continued to monitor her, Maya couldn't help but think about the future. What would happen to her and her baby now? Would this ever go away? Would the officer face any consequences for his actions? Maya's mind was filled with questions, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. The hours after Maya's visit to the hospital passed in a blur. The pain from the officer's kick was still there, though it had started to fade. Her stomach no longer ached as much, but a deeper, more troubling feeling lingered. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, about how one moment of cruelty had shaken her world. Maya stayed at the hospital overnight under observation, but she was eager to go home. Her baby was still safe, but the fear of what could have happened stayed with her. She didn't want to feel weak, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw the officer's face, cold, angry, and unbothered by the pain he had caused. When she finally returned home the next day, her husband, Marcus, was there waiting for her. He had been calling her all night after hearing about the incident. He had heard it from a friend at work who had seen a news story about a pregnant woman being attacked by a police officer. But when he saw Maya's number on his phone, he knew it was her. He rushed home from his law office as soon as he heard, and when he saw Maya walking through the door, his relief was obvious. "Maya," he exclaimed, pulling her into a gentle hug. "Are you okay? What happened?" Maya's eyes filled with tears as she hugged him back. She didn't want to break down, but she couldn't hold it in any longer. "Marcus, it was so sudden. I didn't do anything wrong. He just kicked me." Marcus pulled back, looking into her eyes, his face filled with concern. "A police officer? Maya, this is serious. We need to make sure this doesn't go unnoticed." Maya nodded, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do. I don't know if I should report it. I don't want to cause trouble, but I can't stop thinking about what happened." Marcus, who had spent years working as a civil rights lawyer, knew what to do. He looked at his wife and said with determination, "You don't have to face this alone, Maya. We'll make sure the right people hear your story. We'll make sure he's held accountable." Despite the fear and uncertainty she felt, Maya was comforted by Marcus's support. He was always there for her, and now more than ever, She felt grateful to have him by her side. She knew that what had happened to her wasn't just about a single incident. It was part of a much bigger problem. It was about racism, power, and the ways people were treated because of their skin color. In the days that followed, Maya felt conflicted. On one hand, she wanted to forget what happened and move on. On the other hand, she couldn't ignore the injustice she had faced. Marcus, always focused on justice, began gathering information, reaching out to witnesses, and preparing to take action. But Maya was still afraid. She knew that things could get complicated if they moved forward with the case. What if the officer wasn't punished? What if they didn't believe her? The questions seemed endless. One evening, as she sat quietly on their couch, Maya realized that the fear she felt wasn't just about the attack. It was about the fear of being unheard, the fear of not being believed. But with Marcus by her side, she knew she didn't have to carry that fear alone anymore. She was ready to speak up, not just for herself, but for anyone who had been treated unfairly. She was ready to stand for justice, no matter how hard it might be. The news about what had happened to Maya quickly spread throughout the community. It wasn't long before local reporters began asking questions. People who lived nearby started to talk, and the story was shared on social media. Maya hadn't wanted all the attention, but soon she realized it was necessary. The story of a pregnant woman being attacked by a police officer was a huge deal, and everyone seemed to be watching. Marcus knew this was his chance to make a real change. As a civil rights lawyer, he had spent years fighting for justice. He had seen people suffer from unfair treatment, but this case felt different. It wasn't just about Maya. It was about all the people who had been hurt by those in power. He had to do something. The first thing Marcus did was go straight to the local police department to file an official complaint. He didn't trust that the officer would face any real consequences without taking action. He walked into the building, confident but serious. He knew this was going to be a long fight, but he wasn't going to back down. At the police station, Marcus met with the department's internal affairs team. They were responsible for looking into any complaints about officers' behavior. The team seemed calm and professional, but Marcus could tell they were not eager to deal with this case. After all, the officer involved was one of their own. But Marcus was persistent. "We need to get a full investigation started," he said firmly. "I want to make sure this officer is held accountable for his actions." The team nodded and promised they would look into it. But Marcus wasn't satisfied. He knew he couldn't rely on the police department to investigate themselves. He needed other people to be involved. Meanwhile, Maya was at home, doing her best to stay strong, but the stress of it all was beginning to wear on her. She had never imagined her life would be turned upside down like this. She had never thought she would be at the center of such an important case. But as the days passed, she started to feel a sense of determination building inside her. She had always tried to live a quiet, peaceful life, but now she realized that standing up for herself and others was the right thing to do. Marcus wasn't the only one fighting for justice. Maya's friends and family began to offer their support. A group of women in the community, who had also been treated unfairly in the past, began to rally behind her. They helped share her story on social media, gathering people who were willing to stand up against racism and police violence. In the days that followed, Maya received messages of support from strangers, some of whom had experienced similar situations. It was comforting to know that others understood her pain. But it also made her realize just how many people had been hurt by the same kind of injustice. She was no longer just a victim. She was part of a larger movement for change. Marcus continued to gather evidence and interview witnesses. The more he looked into the officer's history, the more he uncovered. He found reports of previous complaints against Officer Stevens, some of them dating back years. It seemed that Maya's story was not an isolated incident. Officer Stevens had a pattern of misconduct that had been ignored by his superiors. With each new discovery, Marcus became more determined to bring Officer Stevens to justice. He knew that this case could be the turning point. If they could hold this officer accountable, It might inspire others to speak up about their own experiences. And maybe, just maybe, it would start to make a difference in the fight for equality and justice. As the days went by, Marcus became more determined to make sure that the officer who had hurt Maya would be held responsible. He was no stranger to hard work, and his years as a civil rights lawyer had taught him that sometimes you had to fight for what was right, no matter how long it took. Marcus knew that the first step was to make sure people understood how serious this situation was. He didn't just want to fight for Maya's case in court. He wanted to change the way people thought about police officers who acted wrongly. He wanted to make sure that this wasn't just another incident that would be forgotten over time. With that in mind, Marcus began to gather support. He reached out to local activists, community leaders, and organizations that worked for justice and equality. Together, they planned a rally to raise awareness of Maya's case and the issue of police violence. They hoped that by bringing people together, they could make sure the public knew that what had happened to Maya was not acceptable. Maya wasn't sure about the rally at first. She had never been the type of person to seek attention or stand in the spotlight. But Marcus gently reminded her that this was bigger than just their personal pain. It was about fighting for everyone who had been treated unfairly. Slowly, Maya began to feel a sense of empowerment. She realized that her voice could make a difference, even if it was just one story among many. She agreed to attend the rally, standing alongside Marcus and others who wanted change. The day of the rally arrived, and it was even bigger than they had expected. People filled the streets, holding signs that read "Justice for Maya," "End Police Violence," and "Equality for All." There were speeches from local leaders, and people shared their stories of facing injustice. Maya stood quietly at the front, holding Marcus's hand, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the energy of the crowd. People were angry, but they were also hopeful that things could change. As the crowd marched through the streets, chanting for justice, Marcus spoke to the press, making sure the message reached the wider community. "This is not just about what happened to Maya," he told them. "It's about standing up against the way too many people have been treated unfairly by the very people who are supposed to protect us. We are here today to say that enough is enough." The rally was a success in many ways. It brought the community together, raised awareness, and put pressure on the police department to take action. But it also had a more personal effect on Maya. As she stood there, surrounded by people who cared about her and wanted justice, she felt a sense of strength that she had never known before. She wasn't alone anymore. But even with the rally's success, Marcus knew that the real work was just beginning. He would continue to fight in the courts, using his legal knowledge to hold Officer Stevens accountable. He would not stop until justice was served. As the days passed, more people began to speak up. Maya's story became a symbol of the fight for fairness, and the community's call for change grew louder. Maya realized that this fight wasn't just about her. It was about all the people who had ever been treated unfairly, and for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. As the investigation continued, Marcus spent countless hours digging into Officer Stevens' background. He knew that this case was about more than just what had happened to Maya. It was part of a larger problem. He needed to find out if Officer Stevens had a history of behavior that matched what he had done to Maya. If Stevens had hurt others before, it would only strengthen the case against him. Marcus knew that police officers often had a reputation that didn't always match their actions. Sometimes, officers could get away with things because they were part of a system that protected them. But Marcus wasn't going to let that happen. He was determined to uncover the truth. After a few days of searching, Marcus uncovered something that shocked him. He found reports that showed Officer Stevens had been involved in several complaints over the years. These complaints weren't just small misunderstandings. They were serious allegations of harsh treatment, especially toward people of color. There were several incidents where people had accused Stevens of using excessive force during routine stops. In some cases, the complaints were ignored, and in others, they were dismissed without investigation. It seemed like Stevens had a pattern of being overly aggressive and making people feel unsafe, especially those who didn't look like him. As Marcus read through the reports, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was as if Stevens had been given a free pass to act however he wanted. The more Marcus uncovered, the angrier he became. Maya wasn't the first person Stevens had harmed, and she probably wouldn't be the last unless something changed. Marcus knew he needed to take action. He started collecting evidence from the reports he had found, hoping to build a stronger case. The more he looked into Stevens' past, the clearer it became that Stevens was not just an isolated bad apple. He was part of a much larger issue. The system that allowed him to behave this way had been protecting him for years. The discovery hit home for Marcus, who had spent his life fighting for justice. He knew that this case was about more than just one officer. It was about the entire system that allowed police officers to mistreat people without fear of punishment. He thought about the many other people who had been hurt by Stevens' actions, and it made him even more determined to hold Stevens accountable. Meanwhile, Maya was still processing everything that had happened. She felt a deep sense of betrayal as she learned about Officer Stevens' history. She had always trusted the police to protect people, and now she realized how much power they had and how easily that power could be abused. The more she heard about Stevens' past, the more she realized that her story was not unique. So many others had been hurt by the same system. Maya's mind raced as she thought about the future. She knew the fight for justice would not be easy, but she also knew she couldn't back down now. She had the support of her family, her community, and Marcus. And together, they could bring change. Officer Stevens had hurt her, but he had also hurt many others. It was time for him to be held responsible. The more Marcus uncovered, the more they both realized how important this fight was, not just for Maya, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. The truth was starting to come to light, and Marcus was determined to make sure that Officer Stevens faced the consequences for his actions. As Marcus continued his investigation into Officer Stevens, he discovered something that took him by surprise. He learned that Stevens had a brother who had been wrongfully imprisoned several years ago. This revelation hit Marcus hard. It wasn't just a random connection. It was personal. The officer's brother, Daniel Stevens, had been accused of a crime he didn't commit. He had spent 5 years in prison before new evidence finally proved that he was innocent. While Marcus had never met Daniel, he knew enough about the case to understand how deeply it had affected both Daniel and Officer Stevens. The wrongful imprisonment of his brother was something Officer Stevens had never fully gotten over. According to people who knew him, the experience had hardened Stevens. Some believed that the pain of watching his brother suffer had made him angry and bitter, which possibly influenced the way he treated others. Marcus couldn't help but feel sympathy for Daniel Stevens. No one should have to go through what he did, and Marcus could relate to the feeling of injustice. He had worked on similar cases in the past, fighting for people who had been wrongly accused. However, as he continued to learn more about Officer Stevens' actions, he realized that while he could understand Stevens' pain, it didn't excuse the way he had treated others. Officer Stevens' past was no excuse for the harm he had caused to people like Maya and countless others. The more Marcus thought about it, the more he saw how complex the situation was. Officer Stevens' anger and bitterness had clearly built up over the years, leading him to take his frustration out on people he thought were easy targets. But Marcus also knew that he had to separate Stevens' personal struggles from his actions as a police officer. No matter what Stevens had gone through, his job was to protect and serve, not to hurt or intimidate people. Marcus understood that this personal connection might make the case even more difficult. Officer Stevens would likely use his brother's wrongful imprisonment as part of his defense, trying to show that his actions were somehow justified. But Marcus knew better than to let personal feelings get in the way of justice. He had seen too many people suffer from systemic issues in the justice system, and he wasn't about to let Stevens' past cloud the truth. As Marcus discussed the case with Maya, he could sense the mix of emotions she was feeling. She had learned about Stevens' brother and felt some compassion for the difficult situation he had gone through. But she also knew that what had happened to her wasn't right, and she couldn't ignore the way Stevens had treated her. It was clear that both Marcus and Maya understood the complexity of the situation, but they also knew that justice had to come first. For Marcus, this discovery only strengthened his resolve. While he could sympathize with Stevens' past, he couldn't allow that to overshadow the harm that had been done. He knew that the fight for justice wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure that no one else would have to experience the same kind of hurt and fear that Maya had. With renewed determination, Marcus pressed on, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He had a duty to his wife, to the community, and to everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. The road to justice would be long, but Marcus was prepared to walk it, no matter where it led. The day of the court trial finally arrived, and the atmosphere was tense. People filled the courtroom, including journalists, community leaders, and those who had been following Maya's case. Marcus stood at the front, prepared to fight for justice. He had spent weeks gathering evidence, speaking with witnesses, and building a strong case against Officer Stevens. Maya sat quietly beside him, still feeling the weight of everything that had happened, but determined to see this through. The court was buzzing with anticipation. Officer Stevens sat on the other side of the room, flanked by his legal team. He appeared calm, even a little smug, as if he believed the case would end in his favor. But Marcus wasn't going to make it easy for him. He had seen enough injustice in his life to know that it was time for things to change. He wasn't going to back down. The trial began with the opening statements. The prosecutor explained the severity of the incident, how Officer Stevens had kicked Maya while she was pregnant, causing her to fall in fear for her unborn child. The prosecutor spoke passionately about the need for accountability, emphasizing that such actions were unacceptable for anyone, especially a police officer sworn to protect people. Then it was Marcus's turn. He stood up, his voice steady and firm as he addressed the courtroom. He spoke about Maya's pain and how the incident had affected her physically and emotionally. But Marcus didn't stop there. He didn't just talk about the crime itself. He made sure everyone understood why this was so important. Officer Stevens, Marcus said, his voice echoing in the courtroom, was supposed to protect the people. Instead, he used his power to harm an innocent woman. What happened to Maya is not just about her. It's about a system that allows officers to act without accountability, a system that leaves people like Maya vulnerable to violence. We cannot let this behavior go unpunished. As he spoke, Maya felt a sense of relief. She had feared that her story would be lost, that no one would believe her. But hearing Marcus speak, she realized that the truth was on their side. She had been through so much, but this was her moment to make a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. Next, the witnesses took the stand. Several people who had been in the area when the incident occurred came forward to testify. They described how they had seen Officer Stevens approach Maya and how they had heard her cries for help. Their testimonies were powerful, showing that Maya wasn't just telling her story. Others had witnessed the same thing. Then came the moment Maya had been dreading, her own testimony. As she stood and walked to the witness stand, she felt her heart race. She was nervous, but she knew she had to be brave. She told the court exactly what had happened that night, the shock of the officer approaching her, the kick that had sent her falling to the ground, and the fear she had felt for her baby. She spoke clearly, her voice steady despite the emotions that bubbled up inside her. Officer Stevens' lawyer tried to argue that Maya was exaggerating, claiming that the officer had acted in self-defense, but Marcus immediately shot down that defense, pointing out the lack of evidence to support it. He also reminded the court of Officer Stevens' past behavior and how he had been known for treating people unfairly in the past. As the day wore on, it became clear that the case was turning in Maya's favor. The evidence, the testimonies, and Marcus's skilled arguments were making a strong case against Stevens. Maya knew that there was still a long way to go before the trial was over, but she felt hopeful. For the first time since that night, she could see the possibility of justice. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the trial came to a close for the day. Marcus gave Maya a reassuring smile. They had taken the first big step toward making things right. Now all they had to do was wait for the final decision. Would justice be served? Would Officer Stevens be held accountable for his actions? The courtroom was quiet as everyone waited for the final moments of the trial. Maya sat beside Marcus, her hands tightly gripping the edge of the chair. She had been through so much in the past few weeks. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty, it had all led to this moment. Would Officer Stevens be held accountable for what he had done to her, or would he walk away with no consequences? The judge entered the room, and the atmosphere grew even more tense. She took her seat and looked down at the case files in front of her. The room seemed to hold its breath as she prepared to give her verdict. Maya's heart raced. She couldn't help but think about everything that had happened. The night she had been attacked, the long days of waiting, and the courage she had found to speak up. She had never imagined that her story would be part of something this important, but now it felt like the whole world was watching. The judge cleared her throat and began to speak. After carefully reviewing all the evidence, testimonies, and arguments presented during this trial, it is clear that Officer Stevens violated the trust placed in him as a police officer. His actions on the night of the incident were unacceptable and unjustifiable. The evidence shows that he used unnecessary force against Maya Johnson, who was a pregnant woman with no intention of causing harm. Maya's breath caught in her throat. It was hard to believe that the judge was actually speaking in her favor. She had never imagined that something like this would happen to her, and now she was hearing words that brought a sense of justice she had been longing for. Officer Stevens, the judge continued, has demonstrated a pattern of aggressive behavior and disregard for the well-being of others. This behavior is not only damaging to the individuals involved, but it also undermines the trust that the community places in its law enforcement officers. As a result, I find Officer Stevens guilty of assault and misconduct. A wave of relief washed over Maya. She felt her shoulders relax, her heart slowly starting to calm. The words "guilty" felt like a weight lifting off her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt like justice had been done. The judge went on to explain the consequences for Officer Stevens. He would be removed from the police force, his badge stripped away. He would also face legal penalties for his actions. The courtroom was silent as the judge finished her statement, and for a moment, it felt like time stood still. Maya glanced at Marcus, who was looking at her with pride in his eyes. He had worked so hard for this moment, and now it had finally come. He had always believed that they could make a difference, and today his faith had been proven right. Maya reached out and squeezed his hand, grateful for his unwavering support. The crowd in the courtroom began to murmur, some people nodding in agreement, others sighing in relief. There were no celebrations, no loud cheers, but a sense of peace settled over Maya. She had spoken up, and she had been heard. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the people who had suffered because of abuse of power and racism. Her courage had led to this moment, and it was a victory for everyone. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Maya and Marcus walked out together, hand in hand. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There was still work to be done, and the fight for justice was far from over. But for today, Maya felt a deep sense of accomplishment. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had made a difference. And for the first time in a long time, Maya allowed herself to hope. Hope for a better future, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly.